Ever been called selfish just for saying no or needing space? Maybe you're not selfish. Maybe you're just tired. Burnout, stress, and emotional overload are silently affecting millions. Welcome to Stereopedia. Today we uncover the quiet struggle behind the words. I'm not selfish. I'm just tired. A story more common than you think.
I'm not selfish. I'm just tired. A story that happens too often. The phrase, I'm not selfish, I'm just tired, captures a recurring dynamic in contemporary life, where individuals struggle to balance personal needs and external demands. This article explores the emotional exhaustion behind this statement, the social stigmas that frame self-care as selfishness, and the psychological consequences of chronic fatigue and boundary erosion. By examining cultural expectations, emotional labor, and the importance of rest, the article advocates for reframing self-care and recognizing fatigue as a legitimate response to modern pressures rather than a moral failing. In an era marked by constant connectivity and growing demands, at work, in relationships, and in society, many individuals find themselves uttering the phrase, I'm not selfish, I'm just tired. This simple sentence reflects a deeper tension, the clash between the need to care for oneself and the fear of being labeled selfish. This article seeks to unpack the layers beneath this statement, exploring why tiredness is often misunderstood, stigmatized, and how it relates to broader cultural and psychological patterns. 2. The emotional weight of being tired. Tiredness, as expressed in the phrase, I'm not selfish, I'm just tired, transcends mere physical fatigue to encompass a profound emotional exhaustion that affects an individual's overall capacity to engage with the world. This emotional weight often results from prolonged exposure to stressors, whether at work, home, or in social environments, and can significantly impair mental and emotional well-being. Emotional labor and its hidden costs. One critical contributor to emotional exhaustion is emotional labor, the often invisible and unacknowledged effort involved in managing one's own emotions and regulating them to meet social or professional expectations. This labor is particularly taxing in caregiving roles, customer service, leadership positions, or even within family dynamics, where individuals must continually suppress frustration, anxiety, or sadness to maintain harmony or fulfill obligations. Unlike physical exhaustion, emotional labor demands sustained mental and emotional regulation, which can deplete resilience over time. When individuals are required to constantly prioritize others' emotional states, offering reassurance, managing conflicts, or maintaining a positive demeanor, they accumulate an internal fatigue that is invisible yet deeply impactful. Cognitive and affective drain. Emotional exhaustion affects both cognitive functioning and affective regulation. Mentally, chronic tiredness diminishes concentration, decision-making ability, and problem-solving skills. Emotionally, it reduces tolerance for stress, heightens irritability, and diminishes empathy and patience toward others. This decline creates a feedback loop where emotional strain compounds fatigue, making even simple social interactions feel draining. This cognitive and affective drain explains why tired individuals often withdraw socially or respond in ways perceived as selfish or uncaring. Their depleted capacity makes it harder to engage empathetically or take on additional responsibilities. The burden of guilt and internal conflict. Adding to the emotional weight is the internal conflict between needing rest and feeling responsible to meet others' expectations. Many experience guilt or shame when prioritizing themselves, fearing judgment or disappointment from family, friends, or colleagues. This guilt intensifies the emotional exhaustion, as the person ruminates over their perceived shortcomings or fears of being labeled selfish. This internal struggle creates a painful paradox. The more tired and overwhelmed a person feels, the more they hesitate to take the rest they need, perpetuating a cycle of depletion and distress. The social dimension of emotional exhaustion. Beyond the individual, emotional exhaustion has a social dimension. Societal and cultural expectations often valorize relentless productivity, self-sacrifice, and availability, particularly in caregiving or professional roles. These norms implicitly discourage individuals from acknowledging their fatigue or asserting boundaries, framing rest as a luxury rather than a necessity. As a result, Tiredness is often misunderstood or minimized by others, reinforcing feelings of isolation and invalidation in those who are struggling. The emotional weight thus includes not only internal fatigue, but also the burden of invisibility and misunderstood needs. Implications for mental health. If left unaddressed, the emotional weight of tiredness can contribute to serious mental health issues such as burnout, anxiety, depression, and chronic stress disorders. Recognizing tiredness as an emotional and psychological signal, not merely a physical state, is essential for timely intervention and self-care. In summary, the emotional weight of being tired represents a complex interplay of invisible labor, cognitive and affective strain, internal guilt, and societal pressures. This exhaustion profoundly shapes individuals' experiences and behaviors, clarifying why the claim, "I'm not selfish, I'm just tired," resonates so deeply across diverse contexts. 3. The social stigma of self-care. Self-care, the practice of attending to one's own physical, emotional, and mental health, is widely recognized by health professionals as essential for well-being. Yet, paradoxically, in many social and cultural contexts, self-care is stigmatized or misunderstood as selfishness or laziness. This stigma creates a significant barrier for individuals seeking to set boundaries, rest, or prioritize their own needs, fueling the conflict embedded in the phrase, "I'm not selfish, I'm just tired." Cultural narratives and social expectations. At the heart of this stigma are pervasive cultural narratives that valorize self-sacrifice, productivity, and constant availability. In many societies, especially those influenced by capitalist work ethics or traditional gender roles, the ideal person is one who tirelessly serves family, community, or employer, often at the expense of their own health. For example, the selfless caregiver archetype especially affects women who may be socially conditioned to prioritize others' needs before their own. The grind culture glorifies working long hours, pushing through exhaustion, and suppressing vulnerability. In professional environments, taking breaks or expressing fatigue can be perceived as a lack of commitment or competence. These cultural ideals frame self-care not as a necessity, but as a luxury, or even a moral failing. The moral judgment of self-care. The stigma around self-care often translates into moral judgment. Individuals who set boundaries or express fatigue may be labeled as selfish, weak, or irresponsible. This judgment can come from family members, peers, supervisors, or even from the individual's own internalized beliefs. Such moralizing discourages honest conversations about personal limits and creates a climate where people feel compelled to mask their exhaustion or overextend themselves to meet external expectations. The phrase, "I'm not selfish, I'm just tired," reflects a defensive strategy, preemptively rejecting the negative labels associated with rest. Social penalties and consequences. The consequences of this stigma are tangible and often severe. People may neglect their health, risking burnout or chronic illness, to avoid social disapproval. They might experience guilt and shame for needing rest, which undermines their mental health. There is often a silencing effect, where expressing vulnerability is discouraged, leading to isolation and emotional suppression. In workplaces, lack of support for self-care contributes to high stress and turnover. This social penalty creates a cycle where tiredness accumulates, but remains hidden or unacknowledged. Intersectional considerations. It is important to recognize that the stigma around self-care is not experienced uniformly. Factors such as gender, race, socioeconomic status, and cultural background influence how people perceive and are allowed to practice self-care. Marginalized groups may face additional pressures to prove their worth through constant labor or caregiving. Cultural norms might vary widely, with some communities emphasizing collective well-being over individual needs, complicating how self-care is understood. Economic constraints can limit access to resources needed for self-care, reinforcing feelings of guilt or helplessness. Thus, the stigma is often compounded by systemic inequalities and social expectations. Reframing the narrative. Addressing the social stigma requires reframing self-care as an ethical, necessary practice that benefits not only the individual, but also their communities. When people care for themselves, They are better equipped to support others and contribute meaningfully. Public health campaigns, workplace policies, and community dialogues that normalize rest and boundaries can help shift cultural attitudes. Promoting stories that celebrate self-care rather than stigmatize it is crucial for dismantling these harmful norms. In summary, the social stigma of self-care emerges from entrenched cultural narratives, moral judgments, and social penalties that discourage individuals from prioritizing their well-being. Overcoming this stigma is essential for fostering healthier individuals and societies where the phrase, "I'm not selfish, I'm just tired," is recognized as a call for understanding rather than condemnation. 4. The psychology of boundary erosion. At the heart of many modern experiences of burnout and emotional fatigue lies a psychological process known as boundary erosion, the gradual wearing away of an individual's ability or willingness to assert personal limits. This erosion is subtle, often socially reinforced, and deeply psychological, leading to chronic exhaustion, loss of self-agency, and identity confusion. The phrase, "I'm not selfish, I'm just tired," frequently emerges as a final defense, a quiet cry for space in a world that continually asks for more. Understanding psychological boundaries. Psychological boundaries are internal frameworks that help individuals distinguish their needs, responsibilities, emotions, and identities from those of others. Healthy boundaries allow us to say no when necessary, delegate tasks, express personal values, and maintain emotional autonomy. When these boundaries are respected, people tend to feel safe, in control, and psychologically resilient. However, when boundaries are blurred or systematically overridden, the individual's sense of self begins to erode, often without immediate awareness. How boundary erosion begins. Boundary erosion rarely occurs all at once. It is often the result of repeated small compromises, saying yes when one means no, agreeing to obligations out of guilt, fear of disappointing others, or not wanting to cause problems. Over time, these moments compound, creating a pattern where the individual habitually places others' needs above their own. This process is particularly common in caregiving roles, parents, nurses, teachers, etc., workplaces with poor work-life balance, codependent or emotionally manipulative relationships, cultures or environments that glorify self-sacrifice. People internalize the belief that saying no or protecting their time and energy is selfish, inconsiderate, or weak. This belief leads them to ignore or suppress their limits until exhaustion sets in. The psychological consequences. As boundaries erode, the individual may begin to experience chronic fatigue and mental burnout, as energy is depleted without replenishment, irritability or resentment, especially toward people or tasks they once supported willingly, guilt for needing rest or alone time, even when it's clearly warranted, depersonalization, where they no longer feel like themselves or lose clarity on their own needs and desires, emotional numbness, a defense mechanism the mind uses when it can no longer manage constant stress, and overextension. Over time, this boundary collapse results not just in tiredness, but in emotional disorientation, where individuals can no longer differentiate between healthy responsibility and harmful self-neglect. Why boundary erosion persists. Several psychological factors contribute to why individuals allow their boundaries to be crossed. People-pleasing tendencies, often rooted in childhood conditioning where love or approval was conditional on compliance. A low self-worth, leading to overcompensation through overserving others. Fear of conflict or abandonment, causing reluctance to assert needs. Internalized societal messages, especially in collectivist cultures or religious teachings that equate sacrifice with virtue. These forces create a psychological trap, where setting a boundary feels emotionally risky, while staying exhausted feels quietly noble or safe. The path to recovery. Rebuilding boundaries. Reclaiming healthy boundaries requires both awareness and courage. It starts by recognizing that boundaries are not selfish. They are essential to sustainability, self-respect, and emotional clarity. Key strategies include reconnecting with inner needs. Journaling, therapy, or quiet reflection can help individuals rediscover their emotional and physical limits. Practicing assertive communication. Learning to say no without guilt is a skill that can be developed gradually. Shifting beliefs, challenging internal narratives that equate value with self-sacrifice. Surrounding oneself with boundary-respecting relationships, supportive environments are crucial for boundary reinforcement. In conclusion, the psychology of boundary erosion reveals why so many people feel tired, not just physically, but existentially. It explains the silent suffering behind the words, "I'm not selfish, I'm just tired," and urges a compassionate reevaluation of the emotional cost of saying yes too often. To restore health and authenticity, we must relearn how to say no without shame and yes only when we truly mean it. 5. Reframing fatigue as a legitimate signal. Fatigue is often misunderstood, dismissed as weakness, laziness, or something to push through. But in truth, fatigue is not a flaw in our character. It's a vital signal from the body and mind, a message that something needs attention. Reframing fatigue not as a failure, but as important feedback, is a crucial step in breaking the cycle of overextension and reclaiming emotional and physical health. Fatigue as a biological alarm system. At the most basic level, fatigue is a biological mechanism evolved to protect us from harm. Just as pain tells us to withdraw our hand from a hot surface, fatigue tells us to slow down, rest, and recover. Ignoring this signal doesn't make us strong. It overrides a fundamental warning system and can lead to long-term damage. Prolonged physical fatigue can compromise the immune system, disrupt hormonal balance, and impair organ function. Similarly, mental and emotional fatigue depletes neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, increasing vulnerability to depression, anxiety, and burnout. From weakness to wisdom, the reframing process. Reframing fatigue requires a mindset shift from seeing tiredness as something to hide or conquer to viewing it as data. When we stop treating exhaustion as a personal shortcoming and start treating it as useful information, we unlock the ability to make wiser, more compassionate decisions. Instead of asking, "Why am I so tired?" in frustration, we begin to ask, "What is this tiredness trying to tell me?" This new framing invites introspection. Am I overcommit? Am I neglecting basic self-care? Is there emotional stress I haven't processed? Is my environment or relationship unsupportive? By treating fatigue as evidence, not failure, we give ourselves permission to act accordingly, whether that means resting, saying no, seeking support, or realigning our commitments. The cultural myth of endurance. One major obstacle to this reframing is the cultural glorification of endurance. In many societies, pushing through exhaustion is viewed as heroic, while resting is stigmatized as weak or indulgent. This myth teaches people to ignore their inner cues and to see rest as something that must be earned, rather than as a basic human need. Especially in work or caregiving environments, individuals feel pressured to power through despite warning signs, often leading to breakdowns that could have been prevented with earlier attention to fatigue. We must unlearn the belief that constant motion equals value and replace it with the understanding that sustainability equals wisdom. Listening to the quiet whispers. Fatigue rarely shouts at first, it whispers. It may appear as mild brain fog, decreased motivation, or the feeling of being emotionally flat. These early signals are often easy to ignore, especially when we're busy or feel obligated to others. But if we ignore these whispers, they become louder. Chronic exhaustion, burnout, illness, emotional detachment, even existential crisis. Reframing fatigue means learning to listen while the signal is still soft, to recognize it as the body's early request for adjustment, not its final demand for collapse. Giving ourselves permission to rest. Ultimately, reframing fatigue requires that we give ourselves permission to rest without guilt. This is both a personal and cultural shift, acknowledging that rest is not a reward for productivity, but a non-negotiable part of being human. Resting, slowing down, and honoring our limits are not acts of selfishness. They are acts of sustainability, self-respect, and emotional maturity. Conclusion. Tired doesn't mean broken. When someone says, "I'm not selfish, I'm just tired," what they're really expressing is a deep human truth. that their inner system is sending a signal and they are finally trying to heed it. To reframe fatigue as a legitimate signal is to stop apologizing for being tired and to start respecting what tiredness is trying to teach us about balance, boundaries, and being human. 6. The role of empathy and supportive environments. No one thrives in isolation. While individual self-care is vital, the ability to rest, recharge, and maintain healthy boundaries also depends heavily on the emotional atmosphere around us. Empathy and supportive environments act as social safety nets, validating personal limits, reinforcing mental well-being, and offering compassion when fatigue takes its toll. When people feel seen, heard, and supported in their tiredness, they are far more likely to heal, recover, and thrive. Empathy as emotional permission. Empathy is more than just understanding someone else's emotions. It's the act of creating space for those emotions to be valid. When someone says, "I'm tired," a common response is dismissal, "We're all tired," minimization, "You're just being dramatic," or guilt-tripping. But what about all the things that still need to be done? These reactions invalidate a person's fatigue and reinforce the toxic belief that rest must be justified. On the other hand, an empathetic response might sound like, "I understand. You've been carrying a lot lately. It's okay to slow down. You don't have to do everything right now. What can I do to help you rest?" These words don't magically fix exhaustion, but they affirm the person's humanity, creating emotional permission to honor their own needs without guilt. The power of emotionally safe spaces. In environments where rest is normalized and respected, individuals are more likely to listen to their own signals of fatigue and act on them in healthy ways. These environments may include workplaces that encourage regular breaks, flexible schedules, and mental health support. Families that respect personal downtime and model shared responsibility. Friendships that prioritize emotional honesty and mutual care. Communities that embrace the idea that vulnerability and strength can coexist. Emotionally safe environments do more than just allow rest, they proactively protect it. They send the message, your value isn't in how much you can do, but in who you are, even when you're tired. Why support is often missing. Unfortunately, many people live or work in systems that prioritize performance over well-being. In such cultures, productivity is king, and empathy is undervalued. People are often rewarded for pushing themselves to the limit, while those who express fatigue may be labeled as incompetent, lazy, or not a team player. This scarcity of support is even more pronounced for caregivers, who are expected to give endlessly, often without being given care themselves. Workers in high-pressure environments, where rest is seen as weakness. People from marginalized communities who may face additional expectations to overperform or prove themselves. When people are surrounded by these unsupportive systems, their ability to practice self-care and to feel good about it becomes significantly compromised. Empathy starts with leadership and modeling. Empathy and support are not abstract ideals. They are behaviors that must be modeled and encouraged, especially by those in leadership roles. Whether in a family, workplace, or community, the tone is often set by those in positions of influence. Leaders who take breaks without guilt, acknowledge their own limits, encourage others to prioritize mental health, respond compassionately to others' struggles, create ripple effects that shift the collective mindset. Empathy, in this sense, becomes contagious. It gives others permission to treat themselves with the same care. Rebuilding the culture of care. Creating truly supportive environments requires more than momentary compassion. It requires cultural change, built around principles such as psychological safety, respect for boundaries, open communication, shared responsibility, valuing people over performance. When these values are embedded into homes, offices, classrooms, and social circles, individuals feel more secure expressing their needs and far less likely to feel like their fatigue makes them selfish. Conclusion: tiredness deserves a soft landing. Empathy and supportive environments don't take the tiredness away, but they soften its burden. They make it safe to pause, to cry, to rest without shame. And perhaps more importantly, they help transform. I'm not selfish. I'm just tired from a defensive plea into a communal truth, a reminder that we all need care, rest, and understanding to be our fullest selves. The story behind I'm not selfish, I'm just tired is one of human vulnerability and resilience. It highlights the complex interplay between individual needs and social expectations. By understanding and validating tiredness as a natural, necessary signal, society can foster healthier attitudes toward self-care. Moving beyond judgment allows for more authentic relationships and sustainable well-being in an increasingly demanding world. Keywords: selfishness, tiredness, emotional exhaustion, self-care, boundary setting, social stigma, burnout. That's all for today on Egopedia. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more knowledge and discoveries ahead.